evening and welcome to Royce Auditorium, families and friends. This evening's performance is a program we hope you will enjoy. A Christmas Carol. The author of the book, Charles Dickens, was a great English writer. Among his other famous novels are David Copperfield and Oliver Twist. Dickens came from a family of 8 children and lived most of his life in London. His childhood was dismal, and food was often scarce. In fact, his family was so penniless that poor Charles worked in a shoe factory when he was our age, 11 or 12. His memories of this job were so bad he seldom spoke of it. School was the place he attended off and on. Actually, his mother didn't like it when he did attend school, because that meant his family would not have the money he would have earned. Needless to say, he never finished school. Charles Dickens had such abundant energy that he often took long walks. He came to know the streets and alleys of London better than any other person of his time. As a result, he based his stories off what he saw around him. He often included his own family as his characters. In the 1840s, when he was desperate for money during the holidays, he wrote Christmas stories. One of these was A Christmas Carol. This evening's program offers you the musical adaptation to this traditional Christmas story. We are fortunate to have the original score written in 1951 by Mrs. Eloise Johnson. Mrs. Johnson was past president of the St. Cecilia Music Society, and we would like to take a moment to honor her memory for this wonderful work. We would also like to extend our appreciation to Mr. David Ellis, who wrote the score. We would also like to recognize Mr. Wright McCarger for his energetic help with the choir. Along with Mr. Sam Drudy, who is conducting the City High Orchestra. And let's hear it for the City High Orchestra. We are grateful to the Music Society for the honor of performing on this stage. And now, dear audience, please enjoy Mrs. Johnson's and our gift to you, A Christmas Carol.
Marley was dead. He died 7 years ago this very night on Christmas Eve. Scrooge and he were partners for many years. Yet Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name, and there it hung above the warehouse door. Scrooge and Marley. Tight-fisted Scrooge was a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching old sinner. Hard and sharp as flint, secret and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head, his eyebrows, and his wiry chin. Nobody ever stopped Scrooge with a gladsome, "How are you?" No beggars implored him, or children asked him what o'clock it was. Even the blindsmen's dogs seemed to know him. Whenever they saw him coming on, would tug their owners into doorways and up courts. But what did old Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked, wanting all human sympathy to keep its distance.
At length, the hour of shutting up the counting house arrived. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. The yard was so dark that even Scrooge, who knew its every stone, was fain to grope with his hands. Now, it is a fact that there is nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door, except that it is very large. Now, let any man explain to me, if he can, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face! Scrooge was not a man to be frightened, so he looked again and saw that it was a knocker. He put his hand on the key, turned it sturdily, walked inside, and lighted his candle. He fastened the door, walked across the hall and up the stairs, slowly too, trimming his candle as he went.
Up Scrooge went. But before he shut his heavy door, he walked through his room to see that all was right. He had enough recollection of Marley's face to do that. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, all as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody in the closet, nobody under the bed, and nobody in his dressing gown. Quite satisfied, he closed the door. And locked himself in. Double locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus secured against surprise, he walked across the hall, took off his tie, put on his dressing gown, nightcap, slippers, and sat before the fire. It was a very low fire indeed. Scrooge was obliged to sit close to it to feel the least sensation of warmth. Yet that face of Marley, 7 years dead, came up and swallowed the fire. Humbug, said Scrooge, and walked across the room. After several turns, he sat down again. His eyes came to rest upon a bell, which, as he looked, began to swing. Soon it rang out aloud, as did all the other bells in the house. The bells ceased and were followed by a heavy clanking sound, deep down below, as if someone were dragging a heavy chain. The cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and the noise followed on the floors below, coming up the stairs, coming straight towards his door. And what passed in the room through the heavy door, right before his eyes? Molly's ghost!
When Scrooge awakened, it was dark. He remembered Marley's ghost had warned him that he would be visited by the first spirit when the bell tolled 1. At length, the hour began, and Scrooge began to count the chimes.
Christmas again, but it was evening, and the streets were lighted up. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door. It was the place where Scrooge had worked as a young man. There was old Fezziwig, his kind employer, and Dick Wilkins, his friend. The housemaid, the baker, the milkman, the boy from over the way, and the girl next door. Into the warehouse they all came, because it was Christmas Eve, and old Fezziwig decided to have a Christmas ball.
Scrooge watched all this, remembering everything. Why was he filled with sadness when he heard them give each a Merry Christmas as they parted for their homes? What was Merry Christmas to old Scrooge? Out upon Merry Christmas! What good had it ever done him? Scrooge turned upon the ghost of Christmas past and wrestled with it. He pressed it down with all his might. The spirit, stronger yet, repulsed him. Exhausted, Scrooge found himself back in his old bedroom, and he sank into a deep sleep.
Awakening in the middle of tough snore and sitting up in bed to get his thoughts together, Scrooge had no occasion to be told that the ball was again upon the stroke of one. He got up softly and shuffled in his slippers to the door. And the moment Scrooge's hand was on the lock, a strange voice called him by name and bade him enter. He obeyed. There stood a giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch and held it up, high up, to shed its light upon Scrooge as he came peeking around the door.
giant and Scrooge stood in the city streets on Christmas morning. The giant went straight to the dwelling of Bob Cratchit, taking Scrooge with him, holding his robe. On the threshold of the door, the spirit smiled and stopped to bless the home with the sprinklings of his torch. There was Miss Cratchit in a twice-turned gown, brave in ribbons. As she prepared the Christmas dinner, she was assisted by the young Cratchits who danced around the table. Later, from church, came Bob Cratchit with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder.
But the whole scene passed off with the words of Tiny Tim, and Scrooge and the spirit were again on their travels. Much they saw, and far they went, and many homes they visited. It was a long night. The chimes were ringing. 11:15 at that moment. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost, and saw it not. The bell struck 12.
as the last stroke ceased to vibrate. Scrooge remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eyes, beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground towards him.
The phantom moved away, and Scrooge followed him along. They came to Scrooge's counting house. Scrooge turned towards the window and looked in. It was an office still, but not his. The furniture was not the same, and the figure in the chair was not him. The spirit moved away, and Scrooge joined it again. They came to an iron gate, a churchyard overrun with grass and weeds. The spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one. Scrooge crept towards it, trembling as he went, and read upon the stone of this neglected grave his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge.
up his hands in one last prayer to have his fate reversed, Scrooge saw an alteration in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrank, collapsed, and dwindled down into a bedpost. And yes, the bedpost was his own. The bed was his own. The room was his own. Best and happiest of all, the time before him was his own to make amends in. He had been sobbing violently in his conflict with the spirit, and his face was wet with tears. Hearing church bells ringing, he ran to the window, opened it up, and put out his head. No fog, no mist, clear, bright, stirring cold, golden sunlight, heavenly skies, sweet, fresh air, merry bells. It was Christmas Day. He dressed himself in all his best. And at last got out into the streets. He went to church and walked about, watched the people hurry to and fro, patted children on the head, questioned beggars, and found that everything could yield him pleasure. He had never dreamed that any walk could give him so much happiness. He became as good a friend, as good a master, as good a man, as the old city knew. His own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him. It was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well. May that be said of one and all of us. And as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, every one.
Christmas Day is Christmas Day, the bells are ringing, merrily, oh, Merry Christmas to us all, God bless us, everyone. The bells do ring, the bells do sing, such a joyous day, halloo, halloo. Christmas Day, halloo, halloo. Christmas Day is Christmas Day, the bells are ringing, merrily, oh, Merry Christmas to us all, God bless us, everyone. The bells do ring, the bells do sing, such a joyous
Would all former beeps please join us for Christmas Day?
Of A Christmas Carol changes the lives of many Blandfords students. There is no way to describe how inspiring it is to be up on that stage.
Every year, students get the opportunity to come together as a family and perform this play.
Even though Blandford is an environmental school, A Christmas Carol is one of the wide variety of experiences we get to participate in. These wonderful activities include international, fall camp, and spring camp. On stage, I felt sky high, and I was very nervous, but once I was done, it felt amazing.
Eloise and her work of A Christmas Carol will forever be remembered in our hearts. And bah humbug is not how I feel anymore. I am so excited to have this over with.
We give appreciation to this wonderful program that Eloise has given us. There's no replacement to the feeling you get on stage performing.
When Eloise Johnson left us A Christmas Carol, we should thank her so much for leaving us this precious gift. Without it, Blandford just wouldn't be Blandford.